Hi, this is State Senator Jill P. Carter, and you are listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the best source of news and notes on Maryland politics and policy. The Conduit Street Podcast, the official podcast of Maryland Association of Counties.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. This is Michael Sanderson taking the microphone yet again to kick things off this week. Joining me today from the MACO policy team is Sarah Sample. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I am delighted to do this in part because I missed part one of the one we're doing part two of today. A few weeks back, Sarah, you were part of an episode with Brandon Foster from the Charles County Detention Center, and you and Director Foster sort of covered a good bit of ground talking about challenges that face us in managing modern corrections. I mean, this is a county government podcast. It's a central duty of counties in Maryland to manage local corrections. And we got into what that entails and how it's a little bit tricky. I thought it was an interesting conversation. We're really pleased to have Director Foster back with us today for follow-up conversation about some of the finer points in managing a 21st century detention center. Director Foster, welcome back.
Good morning, Sarah and Michael. Good to be with you.
Well, we are so thrilled to have you back. And one of the major differences from the last time that you were on with us is that you are retiring, and I'm so heartbroken about it. There's been such a valuable asset for the legislative committee, particularly, and just, educating me so much on some of the things that the corrections officials are going through. And so, we are very sorry to see you go, but what's your plan? Are you going to end up on a beach somewhere?
Probably not a beach. Probably just take a little break, short break here right after I retire. I get caught up on some projects, spend a little more time with family, and eventually I'll be back to work in some capacity, doing something.
Awesome. Well, that sounds very nice. And probably, I would say, a much needed break.
Yeah. It's been, I've got almost 29 years in public safety and corrections, and it's been a great career. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Right on. Well, so just to recap a little bit of what we talked about last time. So we talked about local detention centers and sort of what they do, almost as importantly, what they don't do, types of detainees and length of stay, staff, and things like that. We really focused a lot on how the local facilities differ from state facilities. And so we were trying to establish that foundation for the conversation we want to have today, which is a little bit about how those policies, how the proposals come together to change some of those policies locally.
Right. And so for any of our listeners, if you missed round one, we will put links to that episode in the show notes for today. I don't think this is one of those stop right here. There are going to be spoilers for this, for this episode of Succession. So don't listen to this podcast unless you've watched the episode. This isn't that kind of thing, but I think the conversation is a good two-parter. So if you're listening today and you missed the one from a few weeks ago, we'll make links to that in whatever order you'd be getting a fuller picture with the two conversations. And round one is sort of the foundation for what we're here to talk about today.
Definitely. And so the goal for today is to look a little bit more closely at bills that have recently been considered by legislators for changes in local corrections. So we just want to troubleshoot some of the things that are, I think, well-intentioned from the last couple of sessions, and just how or why, they missed the mark when it comes to the variability of our local facilities.
Sure.
But before we dive in, Dr. Foster, tell the audience a little bit about the MCAA and the legislative committee that you and many of the other wardens take part in during sessions, just to set up sort of how you guys look at this stuff.
Sure. So my active role in the legislative processes is through the Maryland Correctional Administrators Association. That association has been around since the mid-'70s. Well-established association that really its goal and mission is to, seek to continue and work hard for the continuous improvement of corrections in the state of Maryland, and to enhance public safety in every way that we possibly can. It is comprised of most of the administrators from both local correctional facilities and state facilities around Maryland. These are very experienced administrators. Many of them are directors or deputy directors, wardens or deputy wardens of their facilities. So yeah, we advocate for the improvement, continual improvement of corrections in the state of Maryland. There are several committees, of course, within the organization. One of them is the legislative committee, which I'm a part of. And so each year we're heavily involved in the legislative processes in Maryland, giving testimony and advocating for the things that I've mentioned, the continuous improvement in corrections and the overall enhancement in public safety.
Yeah, and I would say in my role here at MACO, listening to the feedback on those calls from all the different wardens and superintendents and directors is just incredibly valuable when it comes to speaking to some of the issues that come up when we're looking at various bills.
Absolutely.
Right. And that's a role that parallels what MACO as an organization tries to do on behalf of our counties on the sort of bigger picture umbrella issues. Is we have a legislative committee. We have representatives from each jurisdiction who participate in that. And when we talk about the effects of a bill that's sitting before the legislature, we're doing the same sort of thing. Like, Garrett County has a take on this bill that's really different from what you might hear from Baltimore County or from Worcester County. And like having those multiple perspectives work through an organization who has its sort of ear to the ground, I think is a good way it's a good way for the legislature to get broad stakeholder input. So hats off to our corrections leaders, forming a group and knowing that one of the functions they can have is to keep an eye on public policy that ultimately is going to inform and sometimes guide their services and their requirements and so forth. So I think it's a good angle. So I guess as we want to talk about some individual bills, it seems to me, particularly from the setup of round one and the issues that we want to get into today, that one common thing we're going to see is statewide policy that may be sometimes framed around the state institutions, state prisons and so forth. And then it seems like sometimes almost as an afterthought, well, yeah, let's just extend this to the local jails too. Let's make the Baltimore County Detention Center do the same thing that we're asking MCI Jessup to do, right?
Yeah, and we touched on that in the first podcast, in that there is a pretty significant difference between state facilities and local correctional facilities, and often the way these bills are constructed, it's aimed at one or the other. So it's not necessarily a one size fits all. Even the local facilities operate somewhat differently. Smaller counties are much different than some of our larger counties in the operations of their local detention centers. So, yeah, we seek to try to find common ground. Sarah, I think you said, a lot of these bills are well intentioned. It's just that we have to find that common ground so that it's smart legislation that really does enhance public safety and improve corrections in the state.
Right. And so for our listeners, as we talk through some of these individual bills, these ideas that have come to the General Assembly, sort of keep in mind there are more differences between 1,000-bed state prison and a local detention center. There's more to it than just size. The mission and the charge, and definitely the stay and the nature of the folks who are confined in the facility are very different. And that's a big part of what makes this a richer conversation than just, gosh, we don't have as much money as the state does to do this at MCI Jessup down here at the Talbot County Detention Center, right? So, all right, so let's tee this off. Sarah, get us started and talking about some bills.
All right, so let's dive in. Let's get into some of the bills. And I think we want to go through a handful of these. So it's sort of like a rapid-ish round. But to dive in, we'll start with a smaller bill that didn't have as major or as sweeping of reforms proposed. And so this is one that I recall. It was a substance use disorder screening bill for treatment for pregnant incarcerated individuals. And so this is a bill that required all pregnant incarcerated individuals to be screened and treated for a substance use disorder and set up with all the necessary treatment and services before they leave. So when this one came up, like what are some of the things, Director Foster, that jump out for you as far as a bill like this from this past session?
Yeah, that one in particular, and that subject matter, really goes back to, well, we've had Maryland suffer from the opioid epidemic, as everyone knows, for some years. But in 2018, there was a bill directed at local correctional facilities providing medical assisted treatment to people who have substance use disorders. It's found in Correctional Services Article 9603. It's very detailed as to what we have to provide what care we provide to someone who has an SUD. The problem with the bill that was specifically directed at pregnant incarcerated individuals is that it's really redundant. When the bill was passed in 2018, that became law, it covered all of that ground. And so this is just one of those bills that we want smart legislation that doesn't create confusion where there are different laws saying the same things, but maybe with little differences. And so they begin to really be redundant. And so everything that was included really in this bill directed at pregnant incarcerated individuals was already in law.
Right. Yeah. So this one, I think, was more maybe just not fully understanding like the breadth of that previous bill and that it covered everyone.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I remember coming up about this one is that you had to set them up with reentry services. So getting them signed up for Medicaid and I think some prenatal opportunities just in terms of treatment. But if their stay was too short, the timeline that it takes to get somebody set up with those resources, they would have already been out by the time you'd be able to get that done. If they were only in for, let's say, 18 days and it takes 30 to 40 to get them set up on Medicaid.
Very, very important point, Sarah. This goes back to really understanding the difference between, inmates in a prison system and the state system that are all sentenced, and the local jail predominantly were housing confined persons who are charged with crimes and are in a pretrial status. And so therefore, like here in Charles County, the average stay of someone in Charles County is about 29 days. That's an average, counting those that are sentenced and those that are just here pretrial. Often people are here just for a couple of days. And that is, to your point, it makes it almost impossible for the local correctional facility to set up those kind of follow-on services and warm handoffs to other county organizations in that amount of time. So it makes it very difficult.
Yeah, and that's a good thing too, is you can also send people away with sort of the documentation, the resources for how they can get access to those services through other avenues once they're out of your custody.
Absolutely.
Right.
So just as a non-corrections expert, but someone who's done this sort of Annapolis public policy game for a long time, I would just say for listeners, like this is one of the areas where public policy work is really interesting and nuanced. The difference between the one sentence description of, like in this case, let's make sure we have appropriate services for pregnant people who are incarcerated. Okay. Oh, I get that. Nobody's going to be against it at that one sentence level.
Right.
But then when the bill says each facility, all the way from the largest state prison holding people for years upon years down to the local detention center, who, as you said, are frequently holding people for just a matter of days, each facility must do these 7 enumerated items in exactly the way they're written in the bill. You end up negotiating over the fine details of public policy and public services. It's like you may very well be saying, representing the local correction centers across the state, come to a committee and say, we understand what this bill is intending to do, but understand we all have services along these lines. This is mostly redundant, except a bunch of our counties would have to scrap a successful local program in order for us to comply with number 2 and the last thing listed as number 5, and then the entirety of number 7. These are different, or they're sideways, or they're just a completely different framing of the way a successful service is working today. That's a really different message than heck no.
Yes, and that's very important that we do strive and work together to try to find that common ground, because you made a very good point. let's take our health departments in each county. Health departments in each county are very different. I don't think the public really understands that. Well, it's your local health department. How different could they be from county to county? They're very different. And often that would be one of the main resources that we would connect a pregnant incarcerated individual to for some follow-up services. So it really is a situation where most counties offer those services already, and most counties are doing it very well. So you just definitely don't want to take a good thing and complicate it and make it worse than it was before.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're already, in terms of a rapidish round, we've already dove too deep into the one that was supposed to be the shortest one. So here, we'll keep going. We've got restrictive housing bills, the next one. So I think a lot of us remember this when we tracked it. We tracked it through session for a while, pretty much late in the game. But this essentially created a category labeled vulnerable individuals in our correctional institutions. And these inmates were essentially not allowed to be placed in restrictive housing. And the tricky thing is that in the bill, the list of qualifying elements that categorized somebody as a vulnerable individual almost effectively applied to the majority of the jail population. So almost no one could go into restrictive housing. And if someone did end up there, it was under very, very limited circumstances that might not be consistent with why they ended up in that particular spot. There were also significant training requirements that came with this. I want to say it was additional 22 hours per officer. So what are your thoughts on this one, Director Foster?
Yeah, this is one of the ones we pay a lot of attention to. It's been in several legislative sessions in some form. The main thing you need to understand is that every managing official, whether it be a state facility or a local correctional facility, has serious considerations every day in regard to safety of all, safety of inmates, safety of the staff, and we must have the ability to use restrictive housing in some form to keep people safe. One of the things everyone needs to understand is like the particular bill is named the Mandela Act after Nelson Mandela. And where much of it is derived from, the language is derived from, is a UN resolution that was passed in 2015, and it listed 122 recommendations or rules in regard to incarceration. Now, keep in mind, it's a UN resolution, so it's mostly directed at countries around the world that are underdeveloped. In the United States, corrections is modern day in the sense that we have standards and we have laws and we have things in place that make corrections a completely different landscape than many places around the world. Much safer, much more efficient, much more conducive to the overall health of individuals incarcerated. So those things being said, it's important to understand where many of these ideas are being derived from. After covering the kind of where it comes from, we end up finding some of the same language coming from the UN resolution that finds its way into the language of the bills. And so you mentioned things like defining vulnerable individuals. It gets very complicated in the sense that if it covers everyone, a managing official is sort of restricted in using it in a safe way that keeps everyone else in the jail safe and protected. We often deal with dangerous people who are a threat to others, and we have to keep the majority safe. So that being said, it's something that all of us are very concerned with, and we do not operate restrictive housing in the state of Maryland in any way that looks like some of the underdeveloped nations around the world.
Yeah, and I remember someone even bringing up during the conversation that the comparison of our jails that are our local correctional facilities that are audited every 3 years to what the great Nelson Mandela went through. I remember someone bringing up that was sort of offensive, even in and of itself, because of just how different it is. And I think there was another thing with this bill that was brought up when it came to someone being in restrictive housing because of a safety issue. They might be a harm to others. I think there was a particular line that stood out to me that they still had to have access to services that are sometimes privilege-based, and also that it couldn't be from a confined area. So that would then say that a staffer has to sit there face-to-face with the individual who is in restrictive housing for violent behavior, which I think it was when Governor Gavin Newsom was looking at similar legislation. That was one of the things he had pointed out is, these are just way too significant of a safety concern for the staff and for the individuals.
Yes, that's a good point. California had almost the identical bill come up in recent times, and Governor Newsom vetoed it on that very basis, that some of the restrictions in the bill to managing officials of jails and prisons, it created a serious safety concern. And those are the same things we're concerned with in Maryland. We're on the ground, we're right here in the facility, and no one knows better how to manage this facility and the population within than the persons that are on the scene. And we know the complications, and often these things do connect to mental health. But we make serious provisions for services, educational services, having meaningful human contact. That sort of some of the language is pulled from even the UN resolution. Meaningful human contact with others on a regular basis. So no one, and this is where it goes to testimony when these bills are being heard. There seems to be this picture painted by some that people are being placed in a dungeon in some dark, isolated place. That just doesn't exist. And that's one of the things I really want the listeners to hear is that that is not what is taking place in jails and prisons in the state of Maryland.
Yeah. And one thing I did a facility tour, detention center tour just yesterday. And one of the things that I was really impressed by is the length that staff would go to find an appropriate place for an individual that was not restricted. If it's someone who's hard to place, either a trans individual or a juvenile, they were just jumping over, every hurdle possible to make sure that they were not separated and in isolation.
Yes, all of us, Sarah, that we work really hard to try to give every opportunity for placement in the facility to not have to use a form of restrictive housing. And of course, in Maryland, restrictive housing by law is defined as being in a cell for more than 22 hours in a day.
Yeah, and I would realize, go ahead.
We work very hard to ensure that we are using it in a very limited capacity.
Yeah, and even to the degree that I realized that jurisdictions were collaborating with each other, where if you had somebody else who was of that category of inmate, and you had 2 or 3 of them, you can transfer to a separate jurisdiction if they're willing to take the individual, so that they are being housed with people that are part of their category and they're not separate. Yes,
wardens often work with each other to try to accommodate some of these complications.
Yeah, I thought that was really impressive.
Right. So the through line is when you come to the table and raise concerns with a bill that has a long list of prohibitions like this, you're not coming in saying we want to reserve the right to capriciously toss people into a dark room for 23 hours a day. That's not the point of view in Maryland corrections. It's rather, some of these framings are misapplied, and we do need to have some tools available to manage safety for the incarcerated population, for the individual, him or herself, for the staff, and so forth. That there are reasons to use some of these things in a disciplined and smart way.
And
yes, Michael, you captured it well in that statement. Is that the managing official has to have the ability to have a tool to manage behavior and in the name of really keeping everyone safe in the facility. And that tool sometimes has to be used. Restrictive housing is a necessary one at times, unfortunately. And what we can't have, we want to work with the legislators on this. What we can't have is a situation where these things have become so intrusive that it's handcuffed my hands or others to keep people safe.
Definitely. And I think when it comes to those specifics, it's hard for people who are not in that environment every day to really grapple with what the reality is like in one of these facilities.
Yeah, because we want the same thing. We want safe institutions.
All right. That's a good departure point for our next one. So we've got food standards. So this bill was not a requirement. I don't recall, correct me if I'm wrong, Director Foster, but it did try to specify a number of suggested standards in types of food that must be options for inmates, in terms of dietary and religiously based stuff. I do remember specifically the MCAA response, the testimony that was submitted on, I think there were maybe 2 of these bills. It basically went into extensive detail about what is already required. And that was basically the testimony on it. But yeah, go ahead and share your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, a little bit on that topic. What everyone needs to understand is that the Maryland Commission on Correctional Standards audits and inspects detention centers and prisons on a rotating 3-year basis. So every 3 years, full audit done on the Charles County Detention Center. And there's a whole set of standards in regard to dietary requirements. We are already really extensively planning, meals and behind the scenes. Most of us are doing it through a contract food service. There are dietitians, there are professionals behind the scene that are writing menus that have a required calorie count daily. Here in Charles County is a 3,000 calorie day diet. It needs to vary the type of food on the menu. It needs to cover all of the requirements for nutritional value. And so all of these things are already standardized and are happening within food service in all of our jails and prisons.
Right.
So this was sort of an intention to add to it some plant-based options and some other things. Just kind of a standard statement. Most jails are going to provide a couple of standard meals. You're going to have a regular meal diet. You're going to have diabetic. You're going to have heart healthy. You're going to have a vegetarian menu option. And so there are a lot of options, and there are some other religious options as well. Adding a plant-based option, it's sort of already there with the vegetarian diet. But when it all boils down, this bill is going to require some things that would have put some extra demands that make food service in institutions very difficult and potentially very costly.
Yeah. And I remember that it was at least a consideration in the bill language where I think it said that you only had to implement the standard changes if it didn't have a change in your cost. Because I think that was something that they understood, especially with inflation. That number can get out of control pretty quickly.
Yes, and all the follow-up discussions that I had with my fellow colleagues, other wardens in the state, when they consulted with their food service vendors, the simple answer was yes, it was going to be more costly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is a case of, particularly in the corrections universe, but some of this applies globally, that the state legislature doesn't necessarily operate in a complete vacuum. That someone may come to a member of the committee who oversees criminal and corrections issues and so forth, and say we should put in a bill to make sure everybody has all these food options when they're in jail or when they're in prison. And that sounds pretty good. And someone drafting the bill might say, you know what, there's nothing in the state statute that really speaks to this directly. So this is new territory. We have to create this from scratch. But the reality is, like you said, there's a standards commission in Maryland that already audits and reviews the practices of all these institutions and evaluates things like dietary options and so forth. And don't forget, some of this stuff happens in courts, that someone sues under the 8th Amendment or whatever grounds, saying, I should be entitled to this type of a meal as a result of my religious beliefs. And that sort of stuff arises in case law and then gets embedded in those practices, even if it doesn't sit in state statute in the annotated code that the General Assembly is most comfortable with. That doesn't mean we're not doing it. And that doesn't mean we're not being checked that we're doing this responsibly.
Exactly. And when you go back and look at the code, that wouldn't necessarily be there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point, Michael. There's a lot of case law out there actually regarding dietary requirements and different suits that have been brought over many years. And in many cases, the courts have sided with the institution that sometimes these things are overburdensome and would require just too much and would be too costly.
Right. But I mean, I think I'm fair in saying that's sort of as it ought to be, right? I mean, you've enshrined protections for, against cruel and unusual punishment in the United States Constitution. It's in our Bill of Rights that the relationship between the government or the state when we confine an individual for criminal activity, or they're convicted of something or they're awaiting trial or whatnot, whatever the circumstances, like we have a custodial duty to treat those people with dignity and fairness. So, I mean, all that stuff being sorted out in the courts, that's a feature, not a bug in some ways.
Yes.
Right.
I agree.
All right. So moving on to the next one, we've got a bill that was regarding the placement of trans, intersex, and non-binary inmates. And so this required to either house these individuals with their preferred gender or provide separate accommodations if that was not possible, but could not be in restrictive housing. And then it also specified that when asking them their preference for placement, they don't have to answer. So this one was a little complicated. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, Sarah. So, this is something that's certainly come up in more conversation in recent years in corrections. Where we are right now is, and I gave this in testimony in the last session, is the Fourth Federal Circuit, which we are in. They had a lawsuit before them, Williams v. Kincaid. Kincaid would be the sheriff of Fairfax County. Williams was a incarcerated individual in Fairfax County Detention Center that sued in regard to the transgender status that they were claiming, and they were being discriminated against. So essentially what the Fourth Circuit decided was that, one, there are American Disability Act protections in regard to transgender, a transgender inmate. And the other thing that it really directed us to do, if you will, was to adjust our policy, and our policy should be one that doesn't solely base the decision as to their what their biological sex is. It has to be a policy that is wide based on all of the factors: criminal history, behavioral history, all of the other factors that we normally consider when we classify an inmate to a particular unit. It just can't solely be based on their sexual orientation, and therefore, you stay away from being discriminatory. So that's what the Fourth Circuit directed us. Now, here's what I'm thinking is that this becoming such a topic in corrections that an important one, the Supreme Court, I think, is going to have to weigh in at some point to really settle the matter. Because unfortunately, we are seeing across the nation, we're hearing stories of persons that are claiming to be transgender that are really manipulating to find themselves in another institution for other reasons. And there are dangers in that, and there are complications with that, and we need to protect other people from that. The manipulation, but we are seeing that become more prevalent. So, again, we want safe institutions.
Yeah. Well, another thing, I think you pointed out sort of the layers of things you have to consider when it comes to the placement of someone. I think that's really important to think about when you're trying to figure out where in a facility that has limited staff and space where that individual can go. And when we talk about these different categories and placement, I think I've talked to some corrections directors who they'll have one female in their facility, and that individual needs to be separated, but you don't want to isolate them. And so sometimes they have a hard time making sure that that individual is getting services consistent with the rest of the group because you're catering to a single individual. But then you've also got some detention centers, I think it's Dorchester, have 18, and that's a large number of females for a facility. So you've got that fluctuation, but then you also have to think about the categories. You've got adult female, adult male, and then you have a separation need for juveniles. And then you've got juvenile male, juvenile female. And then you add trans, intersex, non-binary. The amount of spaces you're needing in a facility and trying to keep them from being isolated, it just gets really, really tricky to make sure that, you're following all these rules, but you're sometimes just limited to the finite amount of staff and spacing that you've got when you've got that many categories.
How true that is. Every facility in its physical structure is just different. Some are older, some are newer. You go to some of the smaller counties, these are small jails, and they just don't have the space to really separate people in the way you just described. So it creates those very complicated matters of space and as you mentioned, we are short staffed. So it makes it very difficult.
Right. And I guess, this is another case where as managers of detention centers and correctional facilities, you and your colleagues are trying to articulate, we're making reasonable accommodations where we can when we're presented with a challenge with a confined person who's in a difficult category, and that this is evolving and changing. I think some of these legal questions sort of pin back to whether these issues track as actual disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But even if that were the case, which it looks like the courts have decided that's not the case, but the notion of a reasonable accommodation has always been the centerpiece even of the ADA, that you can't necessarily build 7 courthouses for all these different classes of people who need to have access to justice. In the same way, we probably can't expect the public to support 7 different detention centers for even our smallest jurisdictions to have a one-to-one accommodation for that many baskets of individuals. So like you said, Sarah, we see at the local centers, folks saying, okay, here's how we're going to divide up our space. We're going to make sure things are safe. We're going to make things people are treated fairly. And we're going to absolutely abide by the spirit of what legislation like this is talking to, even if not the letter, if it's too narrow, I guess.
Sure, Michael. We need to we need to follow the direction that we've been given from the Fourth Circuit, adjust and revise our policies to reflect that. And in testimony, I said a couple things that I think are really important. One, every jail and prison in Maryland, it works hard to prevent any discrimination against anyone. We have policies, longstanding policies, anti-discriminatory policies in place. And ultimately, what the legislature needs to consider is, as these things are being hammered out in the courts, and ultimately, I still think the Supreme Court needs to weigh in. It would be a little premature to pass law in the state of Maryland that mandates certain things when these are really unresolved matters, because my fear is that ultimately it's going to lead to a flood of lawsuits, potentially in Maryland, and end up costing counties a lot of money.
Yeah. And I would say, on top of the fact that you are trying to do the best you can, you're, making sure these are safe spaces, the staff is safe, the people are safe, but then I would add too that cross-jurisdictional collaboration. They're going to really extreme lengths to make sure that they are not, isolating people, or not putting people in a category that isn't appropriate for them.
Right. And that happens today, not necessarily because of a bill, but because these are professionals trying to do the right thing.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So moving on, we've got medication-assisted treatment in local detention centers. So this is not a bill that was recent. This is from, I want to say, 2019, or Director Foster, you said maybe 2018?
2018.
2018. Okay. And so this is a bill that required all local detention centers to assess an individual for an opioid use disorder and treat them for it. And what that treatment looks like is that you've got to provide one of all three tiers of the medication for this type of treatment. So it's essentially three different types of medication, and then counseling and peer recovery services. And so tell us a little bit about how this one's played out.
All right. So, 2018 HB 116 was passed. It's in Correctional Services Article 9-603. It was started, the language of the law started with a pilot program and a handful of detention centers that elected to start those pilots. And then COVID hit, and it really put a wrinkle in those jails being able to fully implement and kind of get that pilot program going, which led to not really producing enough data and enough information out of the pilot for the other detention centers to work with. That was the idea. And then ultimately, we were up against a deadline of January of 2023 that the law became fully implemented to all counties. So every county local detention center had to provide medication-assisted treatment to incarcerated individuals. So we're here. Some are still struggling to get their program completely up and running. Most have it or have already had some form of MAT in place. And so we're continuing to meet the members of the MCAA and trying to work with each other and assist each other in getting to the point where everyone is fully compliant with the law. That's where it stands right now. The big obstacle has been and continues to be is funding, because it states clearly in that section of law that the state will fund this program for all the local jails, and the funding has not been provided. So some of the jails are continuing to struggle with how they're going to do this and where the funding's coming from. And so that's really what we need to resolve in future legislative sessions.
Yeah, and I would also add, that's something I had a conversation with GOCAP, the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, and one of the things they were sharing with me is that their most recent update is that 75%, or all facilities are 75% of the way there, but the 25% that's left is really things like access to methadone in rural areas that are kind of out of their control. And then what you just pointed out, which was the funding access and how that hasn't come through the way it was expected based on the language of the bill. So
Yes.
they're getting there, but they've got these barriers that just are sort of out of their hands.
Yeah, I can assure you, everyone's working to get there and be fully compliant. It's just there's so many obstacles, funding being the big one. But yes, you just made a mention to it. In rural areas, methadone is not something that most local detention centers can provide through their pharmaceutical services or medical services. Even in Charles County, I've contracted or have an MOU, if you will, with a local provider to provide the methadone services that are required by the law. We can do the other things like Subutex, Sublocade. We can do things internally, Vivitrol. We can provide those shots and then follow-on shots in regard to Vivitrol. So we've got all the components in place. But yes, for rural counties and some other areas in the state, very difficult to try to obtain those MOUs and contracts with others that can provide, especially the methadone.
Yeah, and this is one that we've been talking extensively with state entities that are involved with this, with GOCAP, the Opioid Operational Command Center. And so as far as adjustments that need to be made, those conversations are being had. I think we'll probably even do a podcast that dives a little bit more into the specifics of some of the difficulties with this bill. But as of right now, the lines of communication with the state and the entities involved are open, and everyone is really trying to figure out how to solve some of these problems and challenges. So which is great to see.
Sure. One more thing to mention, Sarah, is that, just to make sure the record is correct here, there's been some funding, but it's only been grant funding.
Yeah.
And it's been limited. And as everyone knows, grant funding, is not a steady stream of financial resources. It could be there, it may not be there. So some have obtained through GOCAP some grant services to get their programs up and running. There was one story of a warden in the state recently that applied for a grant through the Opioid Command Center and was denied the grant. So it's just an example of we need the state legislature to take a look at this and to provide a line item in the state budget that provides for the proper funding as the law requires.
Yeah. And I remember that with when I was looking at the total number of grant opportunities, even if every county got one, there weren't enough for every county to get one. And even if a majority of them had, the amount that you'd be granted was only a fraction of what the actual costs were. So I know that was definitely a barrier for some.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess, I've spent a lot of time on fiscal issues working for MACO and representing local governments. And there is a world of difference when the legislature and the state recognizes that here's a service that is going to require some resources to make it happen. Like, it's going to cost money. So we need to send resources to make it happen. There's a world of difference between make it so using these dollars as opposed to make it so and we kind of have a plan to cobble things together with some federal grants and some assistance here and there, and it probably ought to work out okay. Those are not the same thing. And we're finding out those details with this idea of medication-assisted treatment, which a lot of people support as good policy, but making that happen in every local detention center requires a more coordinated effort than what we've got right now, which is the patchwork.
Yeah. And I think one of the blind spots in the process of putting the legislation together was that probably, and people not understanding that this is the medication-assisted treatment is for some of every single day process. So it's part of the everyday operations of the jail. And so oftentimes with grant funding, you can't use it for ongoing everyday operations. And so I think that was a little bit of a blind spot too, in terms of, that being the mechanism for this getting funded.
Right. Yeah. This isn't me running down to my local, CVS to get my 30-day pharmacy refill. This is a more hands-on relationship. And it's a big deal, but it is one of those things that takes proper support.
Yes, Michael. And I wanted to mention that internally it is a very time-consuming sort of detailed process to provide the services within the detention center. And of course, safety being always the most important thing, diversion is always something we're concerned with, persons taking those medications and diverting them. So yeah, and staffing is another issue, trying to provide the staff to bring inmates to a certain location, and incarcerated individuals to a certain location, and administer the medications, finding counselors, finding peer mentors. All these things can be very complicated internally and in our operations.
Well, so definitely more to come on this one, because we're talking with all the stakeholders on this as we get into session. So let's move into the last one that we've got here. And so this is not a state mandate, as far as I understand. This is a federal one. So I believe this is also 2018, and it requires the sight and sound separation of juveniles housed in adult detention centers. So in essence, the juvenile must not be able to hear or see adult detainees. So tell us a little bit about how this one plays out.
Yeah, so a little background on this. You're correct. There's a federal act that was, they call it Grassley Act, Senator Grassley. It's the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Program. And that act was passed, federal act, in 2018. It is mandatory, of course, for federal institutions. It would be mandatory for state institutions, but not for local institutions. It would be mere suggestion to local institutions. I can tell you, most locals have long implemented best practices when it comes to any juvenile we are holding. In the state of Maryland, there have been a lot of revisions to law in regard to juveniles and crimes that juveniles can be charged as adults. And so it's already limited, but in the rare occasion that a local detention center is housing a juvenile who's charged as an adult, which is the only way we can hold them. Otherwise, they have to go to a juvenile detention center. Brings a certain serious considerations for us as to how we manage the juvenile charge as an adult. So that's sort of the background. It comes from the DPP program or act, federal act. Where we are in Maryland is we're having discussions about this. There seems to be a general sentiment that the state desires not to have juveniles in adult facilities.
That's what I heard. Yeah.
It would take some revision of criminal law to if you just absolutely just no way, no how, no circumstance that a juvenile would ever enter into an adult detention center, you'd have to change some criminal law.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are other charges that a juvenile who is charged with an adult by current Maryland law, they can't go to the juvenile detention center if they're charged with certain serious crimes. They have to be held in the adult detention center.
Yeah.
When it all boils down, what is the most the biggest obstacle here for a local jail is if we were required to follow every piece and part of the JJDPP Act, you would have to build new facilities. There would be no other way to accomplish it. And now you're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars for each and every county to have to build either wings or facilities that can house juveniles, keep them separate, male, female, co-defendants, enemies, and also have self-contained services and service areas like recreational areas, educational areas, classrooms. I mean, you would have to build new facilities or new wings onto facilities to properly accomplish what it requires.
I think that's, it's an extension of the same conversation we're having on a number of these bills. There's no one out there who's actively trying to give short shrift to juvenile inmates, right? And saying, well, we're just going to toss them in with Gen Pop and see what happens. But, so you do our best and you manage this wisely, but having the to the fine tooth mandate is where suddenly these things can blow up into massive expenses beyond what you might imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, so that is all the bills that we were going to go through today. So I guess maybe let's close out with some parting thoughts on, I don't know, maybe what we're hoping to see in the next session when it comes to these types of bills and the styles, the collaborations and the allies that we try to work with to make some of the corrections legislation and proposals just sort of meet the facilities where they are and understand their nuances. I think for me, it's the educational piece I've found is very, very powerful in these conversations. Because a lot of times you've got people that, like I said at the beginning, they really are wanting to do the right thing, but they just don't understand enough about how these local facilities operate and then how they operate differently from each other. So I think collaboration and education is really a major goal of mine in terms of relationships going into the next session on correction stuff.
Yes, Sarah, that's important. I advocate for that and have mentioned that many times that we've really got to work together. On one side, you have advocacy groups, that are in the ear of politicians. On the other side, you have the public safety element, the people who are in public safety, working every day, trying to keep the citizens of Maryland safe. And there just has to be this conversation that hopefully takes place way in advance of the beginning of the legislative session, so that we know where our common ground is and we know what the goals are. What are we trying to achieve here in the name of public safety and how our local jails and prisons in the state are run.
Exactly.
So yeah, the collaboration is going to be important. Specifically, if I could touch on a couple of areas that I see probably need to be addressed, I think the one on MAT and the funding has really got to get some serious attention. Mm-hmm. The law currently says that it will be funded by the state, and we've got to do some work here to assure that that's being followed on the state end, and that they have laid out a financial plan, a budget, where they have worked into that budget the right amount of financial resources to go to the counties to fund it.
Yeah, I was saying I think it's good those conversations, they're following some of the model that we're talking about, which is talk about it early. And I think the other thing that saves us is time once session starts and things get crazy. Because if the bill doesn't get drafted, with everyone's interests in mind at the beginning, getting it changed at that point when you've got all these other things going on, you lose a lot of time if the collaboration doesn't happen before.
Yeah, I agree. It's got to happen way in advance. I'd say now in the summer, early fall, we really need to be meeting and talking about some of these issues. Yeah. Another one that comes to mind, which is not anything we've talked about so far, is pretrial supervision. people need to understand. So there's been a big movement in recent years for pretrial supervision in lieu of, or, instead of incarcerating someone. Of course, their bail is limited in the state of Maryland, the use of bail. So as offenders are charged, arrested, and released, many of the courts, the judges in the courts would like to put them on some sort of supervision. That one, when we talk about the differences between all of the counties in Maryland, it is completely different. Most of the pretrial supervision programs were started because of overcrowding many years ago, and they were developed and they are managed and completely run by the local detention center staff in many counties. The difference is there are just so many, they're so vastly different from county to county. And unfortunately, I think it kind of leaves the door open for, someone to be able to file a suit, an offender to be able to file a suit that there wasn't equal protection of the law, that in one county, a person can be in pretrial supervision and not in jail awaiting trial. And in another county, it's not available. And so where's the funding coming from? It's all over the place. And what I'd like to see is the state take a look at whether this is something ultimately that should be a one pretrial supervision system that maybe is under parole and probation. And so there's not so many differences throughout the state. So that's just something else that I see on the horizon.
Yeah, I was just looking at one of the rubrics yesterday for one of the detention centers and sort of how the tiers that they have for how someone would qualify for a certain level of pretrial release. And that came to mind as sort of, if this tier is different, in this county, and then it's different in that county, that equity element would really start to come up, why this person gets pretrial release and another person doesn't, because just those differences in the individual tier that they've created.
Yes, Aaron, that all boils down to there are some real national standards on the assessment tool that is used to determine if somebody is a candidate for pretrial supervision. And even that varies from county to county. As you just mentioned, one definition of category or level 1 is different from another county's level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. So it really needs to be looked at, because I think when it comes to justice and equal protection under the law, as to whether someone is released from being incarcerated in a pretrial status and supervised, you need equitable standards across the state.
So, Director Foster, I can't thank you enough for joining us for a second round and digging a little bit deeper into some of these issues. I mean, I feel like delivery of service at the local level is kind of the bread and butter for this whole organization, for MACO and for MCAA, the professional organization for correctional administrators. And I'll tell you, for some of our listeners, probably their main principal exposure to wardens and correctional administrators is through the movies, right? These like villainous, sadistic foil characters that we see in Shawshank Redemption or in Escape from Alcatraz and so forth. So, like, you joining us today is great to humanize. Like, you've given this career in public service, and you exude earnestness and sincerity in wanting to do the right thing. Doing so on behalf of your professional peers is a really good face to put on this kind of public service. It's not the kind of thing we talk about as much as some other things, but I think it's time really well spent. We're going to spend time at the MACO conference talking about medication-assisted treatment and that continuing dilemma that we got into today. So folks need to register for the conference, get involved there. But let's wrap up this episode with big thanks to Director Foster and to Sarah Sample for joining. Friends, as always, if you enjoy the Conduit Street podcast, please subscribe. That way, all these episodes will be delivered directly to the device of your choice. And go ahead and send that 5-star review. That way, your friends will find out what they've been missing out on. So you can follow along on social media, on Facebook and Twitter. Are we still calling it Twitter? I don't know. And, of course, the Conduit Street blog. So for Sarah Sample, today's guest, Director Brandon Foster, this is Michael Sanderson signing off. We will talk to you soon.